Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Hub on Islamic Studies called HISC Seerah session 226. And we're continuing the third recap of the Seerah going back from 2016. Last time, on the second recap, we did session 8, which was Abraha and the Year of the Elephant, session 9, which we looked at idolatry and the introduction of idols by people like Amr ibn Luhay. Session 10 was about some stories about Hashim, some stories about Abdul Muttalib, how they both became legends, and some of the qualities that the Arabs had that made them prepared for leadership amongst the other Arabs and the world for when Revelation starts. Session 11 was looking at the religion of Ibrahim, the four Hunafa. Talked about Waraq bin Nawfal, Ubaidullah ibn Jash, Uthman ibn al-Hawarith, and Zayd bin Amr ibn Nufail. And we also talked about the story of Salman al-Farsi from Persia, and his journey from Persia through Turkey through to Medina. Session 12 was looking at some of the biblical predictions of prophethood. Also, we looked at the story of Abdul Muttalib, and then also the marriage of his son Abdullah to Amina. Session 13 was some more specific biblical predictions from Isaiah, Deuteronomy, etc. And then we started the actual birth of the Prophet ﷺ. He was born at noon on a Monday in Rabi' Awal. And then session 14, we talked about the early years of the Prophet ﷺ, his time in the desert with Halima from Banu Sa'd bin Bakr, the foster nurse, the story of Jibril opening up his chest and washing his heart, taking out the black spot, and then how Halima returned the Prophet ﷺ back to Makkah, to Amina, who then took her son, Prophet ﷺ, to Yathrib, spent some time with his relatives there. She died on the way back, and he was looked after them by Abdul Muttalib for a further couple of years until Abdul Muttalib passed away when he was over 100 years old, but the Prophet was about 8 years old. So moving then on to session 15, and looking at the early life of the Prophet ﷺ and a specific story about Buhaira the monk and the Prophet ﷺ being a shepherd. So again, just quickly recapping on all of those things. So the story about the Prophet ﷺ and Buhaira goes that Abu Talib was traveling on a business trade towards Syria, towards Basra, for some trade. His business wasn't doing particularly well, and so he's having to go further and further to try and generate more business. On the way, on one of his business travels, there's a Christian monk called Buhaira who sees the caravan, and he notices that there's a cloud hovering over the caravan, and then the trees are bending over and providing shade to people there. And so he invites these people to dinner to find out what's going on. And then he says, "Oh, we're missing someone." And then and the Prophet was only a boy at this point, maybe a 10-year-old boy or a very young boy. And then this monk asked the Prophet some questions, and then he proudly pronounces at the end that this young boy will be king of the Arabs. So that's the story. But then in the actual study cycle, we talked about how this is unlikely to have happened, how this is likely to be a fabricated story. The chain of narrations around this story of the monk is quite weak. There are some missing bits to it. And we don't find any reference to this occurrence anywhere else in the Seerah. And you'd think, as we'll do, inshallah, this week and more likely next week, when public revelation starts, people would normally then hark back to this occurrence that happened, 20, 30 years ago. They will say, "Oh, don't you remember this particular monk predicted this?" But none of that actually happened. So it's unlikely that this story is actually a real story. It sounds nice, but it's probably untrue. Then we also talked about how the Prophet ﷺ grew up as a child. He was poor. We talked about how he was double orphaned. His father passed away, mother passed away, then his grandfather, and he doesn't have the backing of a family to get him educated, get him skilled up, to get him sort of into sort of the trade. He then gets looked after by his uncle Abu Talib, who, although is the leader of Banu Hashim, is not particularly rich now. He's, his wealth has dwindled as well, but he's still the titular head of Banu Hashim. So the Prophet, he is poor, he's uneducated, unskilled, and an orphan. So he goes for any unskilled jobs that are going, and essentially he becomes a shepherd of sheep to begin with. This is a sort of a very menial, unskilled task. All the prophets have been shepherds of sheep, and the Prophet mentioned this, and it's part of your job description. If you are a prophet, you need to be a prophet. You need to be a shepherd of sheep. So we mentioned some of the characteristics of being a shepherd and some of the benefits of being the shepherd, and I'll just roll through those. We've done these before. When you're a shepherd, you have time to think, good for solitude. You have time for reflection. Sheep can be like men in as far as you need to take care of them or they'll go astray. Some sheep are quite stubborn, and you need to get to know who these particular sheep are, and you need to provide good leadership as a shepherd to all of the sheep. Some of the sheep are weak, therefore, as a shepherd, you need to protect them. You need to approach them with humility, humbleness, mercy, patience. And being a shepherd teaches the importance of animal welfare, animal husbandry, and Prophet mentioned again that referencing that the Muslims should stay in the group as the wolf preys on the stray sheep, the people who aren't in the Jama'ah, the people who go astray, try and go it alone. They're the ones who are most often preyed on by the wolves in society, or shaitan. They'll pick off the people. So stick in the Jama'ah. The other thing about being a shepherd is that you earn your own money. There's blessings in your own manual labor, in the barakah, in the hard labor. So that's good. Being a shepherd teaches responsibility, accountability, the ability to look after a flock, to see physical dangers and unseen dangers. You've got as a shepherd, you're taller than the sheep, so you've got a more of an aerial view of the environment, the surroundings, the horizons. You can preempt dangers. Again, you can use these transferable skills when you're looking after people in a community or society. As a shepherd, you're used to looking after the animals in different climates and environments. Again, that's good training. Again, as a shepherd, you need to be a generalist as well as a specialist. You need to feed them, water them, shear them, be around to give birth to the new ones. So all of these things, part of the job description. And it gets you closer to the creation of Allah, gets you closer to earth, back to basics. So all of these skills, you can see all the prophets benefited from these types of skills, and it allowed them to be better prophets of men when they needed, or when they had their calling. And again, shepherds of sheep is different to looking after other animals. So people who look after horses, camels, buffaloes, or anything else, these animals have different characteristics. So the person looking after those animals needs to have different characteristics. A shepherd of sheep won't do well with camels, who are far more stubborn and in your face. So again, it takes different skills to be shepherds of these different animals. But the qualities of the sheep are, you can see that the benefits to bring those skills into sort of looking after people in societies. So that was session 15, talking about Buhaira the monk and being a shepherd. And the Prophet in his early years, that's all he did, was be a shepherd, and that's how he earned his keep. Session 16, again, the young Muhammad is growing up. We talked about his trials of youth, being a double orphan, grandfather passing away, and being in poverty, and becoming a shepherd. Despite that, he was from a noble class. He was noble, but he was poor. And so he was able to focus on his character and have good characteristics about himself. And by being sort of on the outskirts of the elite and powerful in society, he was more marginalized amongst the people in Mecca because he wasn't rich. He didn't have the backing of powerful people around him. And so therefore he needed to rely on Allah. And again, Allah refers to this, and he said, when Allah talks about him not abandoning the Prophet ﷺ, and again, it's similar to the reference Allah makes to Musa when Musa says to him, when Allah says to Musa, did we not take care of you? So again, by going through these trials, Musa went through trials of youth and then in the wilderness, it makes them have a closer relationship with Allah. So Allah is saying, forget all of society, it was me who took care of you. And then obviously through this hardship, these many years, over 10 years or so as a youngster, looking after himself, he develops a love, an empathy for marginalized people, especially orphans, because that's his background. So you can see how this shapes his worldview, his view of social justice and social empathy. And he often talks about the orphans. And if you want to do good, look after the orphans. And again, these years of the Prophet, they are training him to be independent. So he's not reliant on others. It's just him, his wits, his character, and Allah backing him up. So these are some of the things about his youth. Other specific things we talked about: when he was about 15 years old, there was some wars going on, the Fijjar wars, and what we know is the Prophet was, as a youngster, just going around the battlefield, picking up some of the used arrows and bringing them back to the people in his camp. And again, there were some stories about some, the blessings from the arrows that the Prophet used to pick up. They used to then hit the mark, so people, remembered those things. Then another important thing happened, something called Hilf-al Fudool. So when the Prophet, a couple of years before he got married, when he was about 22, 23, during the Hajj season, there was a trader from an outlying area, I think it might have been from Yemen or somewhere. He gave some money to al-Aas, who is the father of Umar, so Umar ibn al-As, and we talk about Umar much later on in the Seerah, one of the staunchest enemies of the Prophet, who later, along with Khalid and the others, become Muslims, and then they become governors, and Umar ibn al-As is the one who opens up Egypt for the Muslims. But his father, al-As, wronged this person who come from Hajj. This person from Hajj had given him some money to look after. There were no banks in those days, so you give your money to a noble Quraishi and say, "Can you look after this for me? I'll collect it at the end of the Hajj." And al-As says, "I'll give it. Come back tomorrow. I'll come back tomorrow. Come back tomorrow." And he never paid up. And this person became desolate. His tribe had left him. He's all alone. He doesn't know how he's going to get back. So what he did was the Twitter of the time. He recited a poem where he criticized the Quraish and their sense of privilege and arrogance and power and that comes with all of that. And he stands up, between in the Hijr area of the Kaaba, and he delivers this poem, and this brings some severe reputational damage to the Quraysh, and it can potentially inflict a huge financial damage on the Quraysh because it attacks the values of the Quraysh. It then means that nobody will be able to trust the Quraysh because of what they've done to this particular person. And then if that trust breaks down, people will then not trust the Quraysh to look after their affairs, to look after the Kaaba, to be in that position of prominence, all through the actions of this one foolish person. So then some of the noblemen, they recognize that this is actually a critical point. They need to do something about this. The maxim at the time was that you support your brother if he is right or wrong. But then, they had to tear up their rule book and then come up with a new way of doing things. And this was instigated by a well-known philanthropist, Abdullah ibn Jadan, who we talk about later on in the Seerah. He gathered the Quraysh and he allowed the Prophet ﷺ, as a sort of a 23-year-old, to be in that gathering and to discuss this issue. Al-Aas came to the gathering and said, well, why are you involving yourselves as the noble and as the elite in this trivial matter? This matter is Fuzul or Fudool. Hence, we get the Treaty of Fudool through that name. But they ignored Al-Aas and they agreed to be on the side of justice and to recompense people who have been wronged, because this could, undermine the very fabric of Makkah and the Hajj and the Quraish and their trade if that trust is lost. Some people didn't sign it with the name because they're illiterate. They just signed it with a perfume, hence another name for the treaty is the Treaty of Perfume. But again, what we see here is the Prophet, even though before prophethood, he's an active member of society. He's on the side of truth and justice, and he's doing things for social justice. And at the time, back in 2015, 2016, in the study circle, I talked about how it's important to be an active member of the society that we live in. And it's important to do things like raising money, not just for people abroad, but for the people in this society, for the homeless in this society. And alhamdulillah, there are lots of people who are since then raising money for the homelessness and homeless people here in this society, including here in Birmingham. So inshallah, some of that benefit comes to all of those people in the gathering. So again, that was one of my suggestions back then. But again, we can link that to the Prophet's actions in Hilf-al Fudool. The important thing is that Hilf-al Fudool is not a legal justification to do bad things or to legitimize non-Islamic things. So what we have to recognize, and we talked about this in the statistical, is that actions need evidence from Islam. And we talked about, again, a legal principle: anything which agrees with Islam or anything which disagrees with Islam is kufr. Anything which agrees with Islam is kufr. So your rules need to come from Islam. So here, there is no contradiction in this as a principles. And so the Prophet, as given this time again, he will still do it. So, but what he's not saying is that, this gives you a carte blanche to do things from outside of Islam. Then that was the end of lecture 16 about his youth and Hilf-al Fudool. Lecture 17, we talked about the Prophet's next stage when he's 25, his marriage to Khadija. So the Prophet, he's been a shepherd for many years. He's a shepherd of sheep, and then he sort of comes on to being a shepherd of sheep and camels. And when he's doing this with camels, he's doing it with a friend of his. And then him and his friend get a job on behalf of the older sister of Khadija. Her name is Hala, and they do the job together. And then at the end of the day, because it's cash in hand, the Prophet, he sends his friend to collect the money on his behalf, and he keeps doing that. So he doesn't interact with Hala directly, and Hala says, "Well, where's your friend?" And he goes, "Well, he sent me to get his wages because he's too shy." And then she would then, mention this in the company where Khadija was. Look at this person, There are other things that the Prophet talks about in his youth when his mates wanted to go clubbing, as it were, or go out to these sort of little clubs or dens, to chill and do what youngsters do. He was getting ready to go to meet his mates, but on his way there, he fell asleep. And this happened the next time, and possibly after that. So then he realized that going to these places is not the thing for him. So he didn't do that. And Allah protected him from these environments, because I'm sure other bad things would happen in those environments when you have youngsters milling around like that. Then the story, moving on to Khadija. She's previously been married twice. First time divorced. Second time when she remarried, she became widowed, but her husband from her second marriage did not have any children, but he was exceptionally wealthy. Again, these are very noble and elite class. He was very wealthy, didn't have any children or any siblings to give that money to. Therefore, she inherited, or not inherited, but she got all that wealth from her deceased husband. So she became the richest woman in Makkah. So and she became independent. And again, lots of proposals came her way, and then she sort of would bat them aside. Then she wanted to do some trade, but she had some bad experiences. She was being ripped off by people that she was hiring to do her trade. And then, Hala mentions, well, why don't you send this chap Muhammad? And she goes, okay, fine. I'm not sure what experience he has. So they ask him if he wants to do this trade, take it up to Syria. The Prophet then goes to Abu Talib and says, should I do this? And sought his approval. Abu Talib says, well, of course you should. She is, the richest person here. This will be a good job for you. It'll take you away from being a shepherd. Try it. So then Khadija employs him to do this trade to Syria, sends along one of her servants, essentially just to keep tabs on the Prophet ﷺ. They come back and he makes a fabulous amount of money for Khadija. He's been very honest in all his dealings. It's very profitable, and he gives Khadija all the share that is rightfully hers. And obviously, it's all due to his honesty, and obviously the barakah that Allah puts in his dealings when he was out there. So she's very impressed by his character, the reports she gets from the slave, and then later on, her heart starts to soften towards the Prophet ﷺ. So she then discusses with her sister and then sends a servant, Nafisa, to make inquiries with the Prophet ﷺ to see if he's got anyone else, or if he'd be interested. So when Nafisa, she discusses with the Prophet ﷺ, would he be interested in someone like Khadija? He goes, why me? And so it sort of gives the indication that he's open to it, but he doesn't really understand it. So the marriage was essentially instigated by Khadija, but then obviously the Prophet formally made the proposal via Abu Talib for them to get married, and then they got married. Traditionally, it said the Prophet was 25 years old when they got married, and Khadija is anywhere between 28 and 40 years old. Nowadays, a lot of the biographies say she's about 40, but there are other biographies written earlier that say she's probably about 27, 28, or at least in her late 20s, rather than in her 40s. She'd still be older than Prophet ﷺ, but not that much older. And again, you can see that maybe makes sense in as far as she has many children with the Prophet ﷺ, and again, if she's having children in her 30s, it's much easier than in her 40s. But what we do know is that she was older, and obviously they got married. Then session 18 of the study circle, we talked about Zayd bin Haritha, or Zayd bin Muhammad, and the rebuilding of the Kaaba. So talking about Zayd, essentially because part of the marriage, Khadija, she gifted Zayd at the wedding to the Prophet ﷺ, so from her slave to be the slave of the Prophet ﷺ. So a brief history about Zayd. Zayd's mother and father were from different tribes. One was from sort of the Yemen area, the one from the northern area. So it was an inter-tribal wedding. And so they got married. Then there was a dispute between these two tribes that both Zayd's mother and Zayd's father were from. And as part of this tribal dispute, one of the tribes, in order to get revenge on Zayd's mum, kidnapped Zayd and sold him into slavery. So the tribe kidnapped, sold him into slavery, and then he ended up being bought in Medina by Khadija, and about when he was about 8-9 years old. So he's sold into slavery, ends into the household of Khadija. When they get married, Khadija gifts him to the Prophet ﷺ. When the father of Zayd, Haritha, when he finds that his son's being kidnapped, he searches for him and puts the word out, "Where's my son? Where's my son?" And makes it known that he's keen to find his son, despite not being a very rich person. They're still free. And then somebody the following year from his tribe visits Makkah for Hajj and sees the young Zayd, who obviously looks like his father, and has distinctive features, half his father's, half his mother, so he's not a typical slave, as it were. At the end of the Hajj, that person goes back to Haritha and says, I think I've seen your son. So then, Haritha sells all he has, makes the trip up with his brother to Makkah, and tracks down the Prophet ﷺ, and then basically implores the Prophet ﷺ to be able to buy back. Tells him his story. Says, "Can I buy back Zayd? But I don't have much money, so be generous with me." So the Prophet ﷺ, he's obviously torn here because he's grown attached to Zayd. He's gifted by Khadija, but he recognizes that that this is a particular situation, and the father is quite anxious to have him back. So he says, "I will leave the decision to Zayd." They call, but I won't accept any money. If Zayd decides to go with you, that's fine. I'm not going to accept your money. You can have Zayd. They call Zayd, and the Prophet ﷺ explains to him and says, the decision is yours. Zayd then decides to stay with the Prophet ﷺ, which really upsets Haritha, obviously. He made this journey, he expected him to come back. And then when the Prophet ﷺ sees this dynamic, he then, in order to possibly assuage Haritha, he says that he frees Zayd. And not only does he free Zayd, he makes a public announcement that Zayd is now his adopted son. So he's no longer from the slave class. He is the adopted son of the Prophet ﷺ, and his name is then Zayd ibn Muhammad. So that's the story of Zayd. Later on, Zayd marries Ummi Ayman, and they have a child, well-known child called Usama bin Zayd, who we talked about at the time of the death of Prophet ﷺ, leading the army. The second part of this study cycle, we talked about the rebuilding the Kaaba. Again, so the Prophet ﷺ gets married in Surah 25, a bit later on. The Kaaba gets destroyed, and so the Kaaba is originally built by Adam alayhi salam. And then Ibrahim builds it on the foundations. That's what it said. But essentially, the Kaaba is the first house built for the worship of Allah on this earth. Its original dimensions, it is rectangular. The height is, if you imagine a camel and someone sitting on the camel, it's the height of the person sitting on the camel. So it wasn't particularly high. It had two doors, one in the east, one in the west. It had multiple windows. It had a flimsy roof, which would sometimes collapse with heavy rain. So that was that rectangular shape was the original one built by Adam alayhi salam. This then caught fire when a lady was cooking near the Kaaba, and the cloth that covers the Kaaba, and we talked about that before, that caught fire and that weakened the structural integrity of the Kaaba. Then a couple of years after that, there was a big flood, and again, it's well known that the Makkah floods because it's in a valley, and then if there's a lot of rain, all the rain sort of funnels into the bottom of the valley, and that's where the Kaaba is. So one of these years, there was a big flood, and that structurally weakened the Kaaba even more, and it's sort of essentially about to collapse. They can see it's not going to stay up. So it's the job of the Quraish, who are looking after, they are the custodians of the house, that they need to then rebuild it. Otherwise, it'll collapse and their prestige will go, and people won't come for the Hajj and business and all that sort of stuff. So then they decide to rebuild the Kaaba. So they will only accept pure money. Even the Quraysh recognized that you can't have money through gambling or prostitution or other things like that. They said only pure money will go towards rebuilding the Kaaba. They hear about that there was an Abyssinian king who wanted to build or rebuild a church, and he had sent a boatload of marble and top quality wood and craftsmen to build this church in the Arabian Peninsula. That ship had not got shipwrecked, but it basically got damaged in some storms, and then it ran aground near Jeddah, and they had to offload all the stuff. So the Quraysh heard about this. They raised money to buy the goods and hire these expert craftsmen to rebuild the Kaaba, because obviously they don't have the expertise to build a structure like that, so they had to hire the craftsmen with it. So they brought all the stuff that they could, and then they're waiting to rebuild the Kaaba, but then to rebuild it, you need to demolish it. So they were all afraid to demolish it because they're superstitious. If anyone starts to demolish it, maybe the gods or Allah will not be pleased with them and do something with them. So they're all waiting on how to demolish it. And then when anyone goes near the Kaaba, there's a snake that is near Zamzam that hisses at them. And then it said that Allah sent a bird to grab the snake and took the snake away from Zamzam. Then Al-Walid ibn Buhaira, and again, it's very famous. We'll talk about that. One of the head of the Quraish, he said, "Well, I've had enough." So he's the first one, takes an axe and starts to demolish each of the main tribes is given one side of the Kaaba to look after, demolish and rebuild. So he goes and he starts demolishing it. All the other tribes, they wait. They see what happens to Al-Walid. If he's okay the next morning, they'll carry on and do their bit. If not, they'll take that as a sign. Anyway, Al-Walid does that. He's fine. The next morning, then everyone demolishes their side and they restart building. But they don't build it to the original size. They shorten it, partly because they ran out of funds to have it the full size, and partly because they change the dimensions. So no longer rectangular, it becomes a square. They also raised the height of the Kaaba. So it's no longer sort of, they almost doubled the height from what it was. Camel height to double that. They raised the entrance. So before anybody could go in and out, because it had two doors, now they raised the entrance so only certain people could go in, and they only made one entrance to it. They didn't put any windows in, and they put a proper roof and drainage on the rooftop so that if it rains, the roof doesn't collapse. So then they restarted. So it was nearly finished after a while, but then towards the end, the last piece was the Hajj al-Aswad, the black stone. Who's going to have the honor of replacing the black stone? And then the black stone is on the corner of the side that belongs, or that was given to Banu Hashim and Banu Makhzum to do. And these are the bitterest of tribes amongst the Quraysh. So they all wanted the honor of doing that. So a fight was almost going to break out. Then one of the tribes, he grabs a bucket of blood, goat's blood or sheep's blood or camel blood, and they put it in front of them as a tribe. They dip their hands in and they smear themselves, saying, "We're ready to fight on this." And then all the other tribes, they go and they smear themselves with blood, and then a 4 or 5 day standoff happens. Then they ask a wise person, because of the standoff, how are we going to sort this out? So the wise person says, let's leave it to chance. The next person who walks into the vicinity of the Kaaba, we'll let them decide. And obviously they're going to decide on whichever tribe they're from. Lo and behold, the next person to walk into the vicinity was the Prophet ﷺ. So they're all very happy because they know the Prophet ﷺ will make the right choice. Muhammad, obviously, this is before prophethood. So again, instinctively, he recognizes the importance of the situation. He invites the leaders from all of the 4 tribes to grab 4 corners of a cloth, and then they put the Hajj al-Aswad, the black stone, in the cloth, and all 4 of the tribal leaders grab the corners of the cloth. They take it to the edge of the Kaaba, and the Prophet is the one who physically puts it back. So they all participated in it, but the Prophet is the one to replace it, essentially. So that was the rebuilding of the Kaaba. The next session that we did was the start of Revelation. So I'm just wondering whether to stop here or carry on. So let's just do the briefly. We'll do the start of Revelation next time, then, inshallah, because it'll then flow into the second revelation and the third revelation. So inshallah, next time we'll talk about how the Prophet would go to the mountain, how revelation started, the squeezing of the Prophet and Jibril saying, read, and he says, I can't read. And then we talked in the following session about the importance of knowledge and how once that came, Khadija is trying to interpret what does this mean. She goes to al-Aas, the Christians say that she goes to Waraqah bin Nawfal, and then the famous conversation between the Waraqah and the Prophet that his people will expel him, and he's dumbfounded by that. And then we talk about some of the early converts, ways in which revelation comes, 7 different ways in which revelation comes from Allah to humankind. And then the following session, we talked about the difference between a Nabi and a Rasul, the status of Khadija amongst the 4 of the most prominent women ever, and then the early converts, the private and the public stage of dawah, inshallah, from next time. So until then, do remember us in your du'as. Do follow us on YouTube, Instagram. Any questions, do pass them through. All these study circles are available on audio. The later ones, obviously, from 75 onwards, are available on YouTube, inshallah. So, as I say, do remember to in your du'as, and I hope the preparations for Ramadan are going well, inshallah. Okay, then, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. جزاك الله خير. السلام عليكم.